this is Pastor Jonathan with St. Andrew United Methodist Church, and you're watching the Bible in 5 minutes. Today we begin digging into the biblical text with the story of Adam, Eve, and the Garden of Eden. Over the last several hundred and even thousands of years, Jewish and Christian scholars have interpreted the story in a variety of different ways. Some have interpreted the story literally, saying that Adam and Eve were real historical figures who lived in the Garden of Eden, that God gave them a command not to eat fruit from a certain tree. And when they did, when they rebelled against God, not only were they kicked out of their home, not only did they have to leave the garden, but that their choices have consequences for the rest of the human race. That you and I now are living under the curse that they imposed upon us. Other Jewish and Christian scholars have interpreted this story in more figurative ways, suggesting that the story is really descriptive of who we are as humans, that all of us have free will, that we can either choose to live in relationship with God and others and follow God's path, or we can choose our own path. But when we choose our own path, we break our relationship with God and with others, and we bring brokenness into our lives. When we start studying this passage through a historical lens, trying to dig in a little bit deeper, we discover that this story was probably written in the 6th century BC, which is hundreds, closer to thousands of years after the purported events. And the reason that this is significant is that in the 6th century BC, the Hebrew people were living in exile in Babylon. Up to this point, they've been telling their story and preserving it through oral tradition. And now that they're living in a distant land, they're telling their story and preserving it through written text. Biblical scholars are convinced that this event, the exile, is the most significant event in the history of Israel, maybe even more significant than the Exodus, and that the exile has influenced the way that they tell their story of creation, Adam and Eve, their story of the patriarchs, the Exodus, and so forth. So, one interpretation, one ancient Jewish interpretation of the story of Adam and Eve is that it is a parable of the Hebrew people. That like Adam and Eve, the Hebrew people were given this special land. The land that was flowing with milk and honey. And for the Hebrew people, the land was really everything. This land was promised to their forefather Abraham. And for the Hebrew people, to live in the land meant to be blessed. To live outside of the land meant to be cursed. They were cursed if they were apart from the land. And God had given them the law, a guideline to love God with all their heart and to love their neighbor as themselves. And instead of abiding by the law, they worshipped other gods. They had forsaken justice for the most vulnerable and marginalized people of society. And after hundreds and hundreds of years, God's long-suffering ran out, and the people eventually were exiled into Babylon. And so if you stop to think about it for a minute, there are some pretty strong parallels between the story of Adam and Eve and the story of the Hebrew people who lived in the land that God gave them, and after breaking God's law, they had to leave. And so this raises the question, what is the story really all about? Is it about two historical people who lived in the actual garden? Is it about the Hebrew people who lived in ancient Israel, or is it about us? I'm reminded of an apocryphal story about Karl Barth, arguably the best scholar theologian of the 20th century. And in this apocryphal story, Karl Barth was asked by someone, did the serpent in the garden really speak? And Karl Barth responded, it doesn't matter whether he spoke or not. What matters is what he said. And the point was that sometimes we can get so invested in trying to understand whether something really is something factual and literal or whether it is metaphorical. And Karl Barth, he didn't enter into that debate. He was focused on the meaning. What was it that the serpent said? Look at those words. Those words are important and meaningful. And so I think that can really apply to the whole story. We can get really invested in whether this is a historical factual incident or whether it is something to be understood as a metaphor. And however we read it, I think the important thing is that we don't miss the meaning. The meaning is that we all have the opportunity to live in relationship with God or to choose our own path. So I would encourage you, as you read these stories, as you read the story of Adam and Eve and the story of God, that you constantly look for yourself in the story and ask, how can I love God better? And how can I love my neighbor as myself? Until next time, take care and God bless.